The Harvard Graduate School of Education, working at the nexus of practice, policy, and research.
Good morning. Welcome to the release of Pathways to Prosperity, Meeting the Challenge of Preparing Young Americans for the 21st Century, a new report released by the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm Betsy Brand, Executive Director of the American Youth Policy Forum, and on behalf of AYPF and our colleagues at Harvard Graduate School of Education, who are co-sponsoring this event, welcome this morning. We're honored that Secretary of Education Arne Duncan is with us this morning and that he will share his thoughts on several of the issues raised by the Pathways to Prosperity report. AYPF is excited to co-sponsor this event this morning because the messages in Pathways to Prosperity resonate so strongly with AYPF's core mission of expanding opportunities for the forgotten half, those young people who are neither connected to education or the workforce and who lack the skills in post-secondary education to be successful in today's economy and the workforce. The recommendations in Pathways to Prosperity about creating high-quality career and technical education pathways for youth, an expanded role for employers, and a new social compact with young people are ones that AYPF has supported since its inception, and we continue to promote it in our work with national and state policymakers. My main task this morning, however, is to introduce our next speaker and one of the authors of the report. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to hit the bare minimum of the highlights in his career. Robert Schwartz has held a wide variety of leadership positions in education and government before he joined the Harvard Graduate School of Education in 1996. From 1997 to 2002, many of you may have known Bob when he served as the founding president of Achieve, Inc., an independent, bipartisan, nonprofit organization created by governors and corporate leaders to help states improve their schools. He's also been a high school English teacher, a principal. He's advised the mayor of Boston, the governor of Massachusetts, the president of the University of Massachusetts, and he served as assistant director of the National Institute for Education. Bob has written and spoken widely on topics such as standards-based reform, public-private partnerships, and the transition from high school to adulthood. Please join me in welcoming Bob Schwartz.
Thank you very much, Betsy. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming out on actually from a Boston perspective, what looks like a bright sunny day. Let me just quickly explain the agenda since it's going to be fairly packed. I'm going to try to outline the main arguments of our report in about 10 minutes, skipping over a lot of the nuances but trying to create a bit of a storyline. Then Secretary Duncan is going to make some remarks, after which I believe he's prepared to take at least a few questions. And then my colleague Bill Simons is going to moderate a panel with three terrific leaders from three sectors that, in our view, need to figure out a way to work more collaboratively together if we're going to make progress on the issues and challenges raised in our report. And then we absolutely want to leave time to hear from some of you. Looking around the room, there are lots of people who are knowledgeable and much experienced in this sector, so we're hoping to have a lively conversation. I should mention, by the way, that Bill and I are two-thirds of the Pathways team. Unfortunately, our colleague Ron Ferguson, an economist, many of you I'm sure know his work on the achievement gap and Tripod Project. More recently was a participant in the Gates-funded work around teacher effectiveness. Ron unfortunately had a full day yesterday, and given the Boston weather, could not get out to join us, so we will soldier on without him. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge an intellectual and personal debt. This report really stands on the shoulders of two previous reports. The Forgotten Half report in 1988, which really had a very substantial impact, I think, in raising public consciousness around the fact that we simply were not serving at least half of our young people, those who were identified at that time as kind of the non-college bound. And then a decade later, in 1998, this organization published a decade later look called The Forgotten Half Revisited. We like to think that our report, another 10 or 12 years later, is in that same tradition. The common link between those first two reports comes in the person of Sam Halpern. Sam was the executive director of the W.T. Grant-funded commission that issued the original report. A few years later, he founded this organization and led the development of the second kind of follow-up report. I really don't know anyone in this town who's done more over the last 2 decades to keep us all focused on the needs of underserved youth than Sam. So I'm really delighted that he's here today so I can personally and publicly thank him for his leadership. So, Sam, thank you. In these last 20 years, we've made substantial progress on many fronts. We no longer separate the student population into college-bound and non-college-bound, and every year a growing majority of high school graduates head off to college. But the sad fact and the jumping-off point for our report is that if you look at young people in their mid-20s, only about 30% of young Americans have attained a baccalaureate degree, and only another 9 or 10% have managed to attain an associate's degree. We are hardly the first people to note this fact. Organizations like the College Board and the Lumina Foundation have set ambitious growth targets to raise the attainment rate. College Board talks about 55% college completion by the year 2025. The Gates Foundation has brought a new organization into being called Complete College America that's entirely focused on this problem. And President Obama has set a national goal of regaining our international leadership position on this metric by 2020. We, of course, applaud the goal and the effort. However, I can't resist observing that a 1% annual increase in college attainment over the next 15 years would be unprecedented, particularly if you look at the extremely sluggish growth on that metric over the last 15 or 20 years. But even if we were successful in getting as many as 55% of our young people through with an AA or a BA degree, it does leave us with a large question. What is our national strategy for the other 45% or 50% of young people? And that's the issue that we really are trying to focus most of our attention in this report. How are we going to help those young people acquire the skills and credentials that they will need in order to be successful in an ever more demanding labor market? President Obama has framed a response to this challenge in a powerful way in his 2009 State of the Union address. I just want to directly quote from him so I don't lose that. He said, "Tonight I ask every American to commit to at least 1 year or more of higher education or career training. This can be community college, a 4-year school, vocational training, or an apprenticeship. But whatever the training may be, every American will need to get more than a high school diploma." We prefer this formulation of the goal to the college for all rhetoric that is much in the air these days. For the President's formulation puts the focus on the importance of helping all young people obtain a meaningful post-secondary credential with currency in the labor market, and it legitimizes alternative routes to obtaining such a credential, including union-sponsored apprenticeship programs, industry or community-based training programs, and 1-year certificate programs. It also acknowledges the central importance of community colleges in our system, the least well-resourced institutions in our higher education system, but ones that are absolutely essential if we're going to make progress in realizing this goal. Because the vast majority of African American and Latino students in higher education are enrolled in community colleges, it is especially critical to do whatever it takes to ensure that these students emerge with a certificate, a degree, or a transcript enabling them to transfer to 4-year institutions. In addition to the obvious equity reasons for preferring to focus on a goal designed to reach all young people rather than a goal that realistically will only serve about half of our young people, there is a more instrumental reason for rethinking our college for all messaging. The first step in increasing post-secondary attainment is to do whatever we can to pull more young people through high school. If you listen to the voices of the 1 in 4 young people who drop out, actually in our cities, it's many cities, it's closer to 1 in 2 young people, one of the major reasons they cite for leaving is that they simply don't see a connection between what they are studying and any future that they can envision for themselves. If disengaged kids find most classes boring, the most frequently used term in surveys of dropouts, we shouldn't be surprised that the prospect of sitting in classes for several more years, i.e. of college at least as they conceive it, is a turnoff. When Bill Clinton was president, he used to say that the U.S. is the only industrialized nation that has no organized system for helping most young people make their way from high school into the primary labor market. Put another way, we are the only country that depends almost exclusively on its higher education system to perform this function. One of the most striking findings in the original Forgotten Half report over 20 years ago is that we spend about 10 times as much in public and private subsidies for young people enrolled in college as we do on kids that don't enroll in college. Actually, the reverse of what a more needs-based strategy would call for. So what would a system look like that provided powerful alternative pathways into the primary labor market for young people for whom college, at least the 4-year sitting in classrooms version of college, is less than appealing? To answer this question, we drew heavily on a recently published OECD study called Learning for Jobs, a 16-country look at how a wide range of European and Asian countries prepare their young people for careers. And I should say I was lucky enough to participate in that study. In particular, we focused mainly on a set of European countries, Austria, Denmark, Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, where between 40 and 70% of young people from the age of 16 choose to enroll in 3- or 4-year programs that combine classroom and work-based learning, that lead to an industry-recognized qualification in a very broad range of occupations. There's considerable variation among these programs. In some countries, most notably Germany and Switzerland, most young people are in paid apprenticeship programs, roughly 3.5 days a week, with their aligned schooling complementing that work-based learning, whereas in other countries the reverse is true. They're mostly in school-based programs, but typically with at least a 6-month internship or work experience built in. However, there are several common elements that characterized the approach to vocational education in all of these countries. These are mainstream systems serving a broad range of young people, including some who actually choose to enroll in these programs after having completed the kind of academic university preparation programs in upper secondary school. They prepare people for a very broad range of occupations, white-collar as well as blue-collar, high-tech as well as low-tech. They have very significant employer involvement. In Germany and Switzerland, for example, these programs really are employer-driven, with employers picking up roughly half the costs, mostly in the form of wages to apprentices. And also critically important, they keep open pathways for further education, mostly through a set of polytechnic institutions or universities of applied science. These programs in most of these countries occur within a context of a broader national policy. In fact, the European Union is moving toward a youth guarantee that will ensure a job, an apprenticeship, or another education option for every young person under the age of 25 within 6 months after that person has left school or left a job. Programs like this are designed to cushion young people from the impact of economic downturns like the one we are currently suffering through. Because of policies like these, youth unemployment rates in most of these countries are well below ours. Switzerland, in March of 2010, had a youth unemployment rate of 4.5%. And the ratio of youth to adult unemployment is typically more modest than ours. Finally, I just want to focus on 4 kind of take-home messages, at least my sense of some take-home messages from the report. First, of course, we need to keep working to ensure that all kids get a solid foundation of academic knowledge and skills in their first 10 years of schooling. A common solid foundation, I would say. This has been the work of the standards movement over the past decade or two, and the adoption of Common Core standards should only strengthen that work. The second observation I'd make is that we need to somehow figure out a way to make a much greater investment in career information and counseling and guidance beginning in the middle grades, so that young people and their parents have a much clearer understanding of the education and training requirements associated with a wide variety of occupations and professions, especially those with career ladders and substantial projected growth. Third, we need to bring employers, community college leaders, and K-12 leaders together at the community or metropolitan area level to build programs that reflect regional labor market needs, that culminate in an industry-recognized certificate or degree, and that combine classroom and workplace learning, and that can span the secondary, post-secondary divide. And finally, we need to embed these pathway programs in a more visible public compact between the community and its young people, a compact in which the message is essentially the one that President Obama has outlined, namely that we need every young person to do whatever it takes to acquire the knowledge and skills to fully participate in the economic and civic life of our community, and that we as adults will provide the opportunities and supports in order to enable that to happen. Before hearing from our panel representing these three sectors that I've just said need to work together, I'm really delighted and honored to have the opportunity to introduce Secretary Duncan. Arne Duncan needs no introduction really in this room, but I did want to say at least three things about him. I've had the opportunity to work with him during his tenure as CEO of the Chicago schools, and I know first that he didn't need this report to tell him about the critical importance of strengthening career and technical education. He set in motion a very ambitious restructuring effort in Chicago. When that bears fruit and has kind of finally been implemented, I think it's going to create a real model of what urban districts can do to strengthen and support career and technical education, and I hope he will comment on that work in his remarks. Second thing I'd say about him is, he is a learner, and in particular he has demonstrated a willingness to look outside the U.S. for lessons that we can learn from other countries that in one dimension or another outperform us. And finally, like no secretary before him, he has been willing to use the bully pulpit of his office to lead a public conversation about the urgency of the challenges that we face and the need for radical transformation, not just tinkering at the margins. And he's done this in a way that validates rather than demeans the work of educators. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Duncan.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, and Bob's a good friend, and more importantly, someone I've learned a tremendous amount from over the years in a couple different settings, and I'll hope to continue to learn from him for many years. So please give a round of applause for Bob Schwartz for all his hard work. I'm just thrilled he's focused on this issue and that the Harvard School of Education is focused on this issue. I think that talks about the significance of it. The Pathways to Prosperity study envisions a new system of career and technical education that constitutes, as Bob said, not a tinkering but a radical departure from the vocational education of the past. The need for that transformation is absolutely pressing, and I applaud the report's frank discussion of the shortcomings of our current CTE system and its call to strengthen both the rigor and the relevance of career and technical education. I'm not here today to endorse the specifics of any policy recommendations, but I want instead to suggest two takeaway messages from your study and our department's reform efforts. First, for far too long, CTE has been the neglected stepchild of education reform, and that neglect has to stop. And second, the need to reimagine and remake career and technical education is urgent. CTE has had an enormous, if often overlooked, impact on students, on school systems, and our ability to prosper as a nation. The mission of CTE has to change. It can no longer be about earning a diploma and landing a job after high school. The goal of CTE 2.0 should be that students earn a post-secondary degree or an industry-recognized certification and land a job that leads to a successful career. There's a lot of talk these days about the need to boost college and career readiness. But the truth, and I think I include myself here, is that most of the current debate is about college readiness. And too often, career readiness has been an unrelated afterthought. It seems easier to define college readiness than career readiness, even if there is a great deal of overlap. At our department, we define college-ready students as those who have the knowledge and skills necessary to succeed in credit-bearing courses from day one without the need for remediation. That standard must be the new bar for success for all high schools and all students, instead of the old goal of simply getting students a diploma. The bar for a career-ready student is just as demanding. CTE students must also have the academic skills to be able to engage in post-secondary education and training without the need for remediation. The cause of strengthening CTE programs should never be an excuse for reducing rigor and tracking students away from pursuing a college degree. Students pursuing non-degree post-secondary credentials still need college-ready academic skills. As all of you know, telecom workers and HVAC technicians, while they may not need a four-year degree, they do need high-order math skills, including Algebra 2. Yet a career-ready student must also have the knowledge and skills that employers need from day one. That means having critical thinking and problem-solving skills, an ability to synthesize information, solid communication skills, and the ability to work well on a diverse team. Students headed for four-year colleges need to know these important life skills as well. The truth is that we want all students, whether they are in CTE programs or not, to develop employability skills. And I'm pleased to say that the Common Core standards developed at the state level deliberately incorporate what is often thought of as career-ready skills, such as problem solving and communication skills. The next generation of assessments currently being developed by the states under the Race to the Top assessment competition will also assess these higher order thinking skills. So I start with the basic premise that it is the responsibility of K-12 educators to prepare all students both for college and for a career. This must be both and, not either or. High school graduates themselves, not the educational system, should be choosing the post-secondary and career paths that they want to pursue. For too long, public schools have gotten this backwards. Too often, the K-12 system made these choices for children, tracking them into dead-end courses, instead of providing them with the skills necessary to succeed in college and careers, and the guidance students needed to make good decisions about their future. When you consider that the average age of a community college student today is now 29, I think it becomes all the more evident that college and career-ready skills are really no longer two separate tracks. Students need the same set of skills for both college and the workplace, particularly in reading and math. And it's the job of the K-12 system to prepare them for both options. In our globally competitive, knowledge-based economy, all Americans are likely to face the challenge of a lifetime of continuing education, and all of us need a common core of skills. Today, these employability skills are poorly defined in America's K-12 system, but they are one of the universal hallmarks of world-class education systems in the 21st century. U.S. students will need both the hard skills of math and English language arts and science and the soft employability skills to thrive in our flattening world. In fact, many of the nations that are outperforming us educationally today have far more effective vocational education programs than we do here in the U.S. We can't just copy the vocational education systems of other high-performing countries, but we can certainly learn from them about how to build rigorous educational and work experience programs with strong links to high-wage, high-demand jobs. As your report spells out, the rising demands of that knowledge economy dealt an especially painful blow to our nation's teenagers during the recession. Fortunately, in the years ahead, the information age will also present rich opportunities for students exploring high-quality CTE programs. One of the most troubling findings in the report is that teens were hit harder than any other age group in the Great Recession. The percent of teens and young adults who are working fell to the lowest level since the end of the Depression. Even more disturbing, only 9% of older low-income black teens and 15% of low-income Hispanic teens now have jobs. That devastating reality is contrasted with that of white teenagers from middle to upper-income families who are 4 times more likely to be working than low-income black teens. They're getting the on-the-job experience and the contacts necessary that will one day give them a foot up in the job market. If education is to be the great equalizer in America, disadvantaged black and Hispanic students cannot have less opportunity to work and ready themselves for successful careers or college than affluent white students. Now, even as graduates desperately search for work, we also know that the information age is going to produce millions of new jobs for the so-called middle skill occupations. These jobs require employees to have more than a high school diploma, but less than a bachelor's degree. One recent study from Georgetown University projects that from 2008 to 2018, about 2/3 of the job openings in the U.S. will require at least some post-secondary education and training. 14 million of those job openings will be in the middle skill occupations, filled by workers with an associate's degree or an occupational certificate. To be a winner in the future, President Obama, as Bob says, has urged every American to get at least a year of higher education or post-secondary training. Whatever that training might be, said the President, every American will need to get more than a high school diploma. In effect, President Obama has suggested that every American earn a minimum of 2 pieces of paper, a high school diploma and a degree or an industry-recognized certification. In the years ahead, young adults are likely to need those 2 credentials to secure a good job. That will be the ticket to success and a positive future. For all of its importance, the role that CTE plays in building the nation's economic vitality unfortunately often gets overlooked. Too many educators assume that career and technical training is for the last century, not this one. Many reformers treat CTE as old school rather than as a potential source of cutting-edge preparation for success. This narrow picture of CTE is surprising given the size of our current CTE system. More than 90% of high school graduates take at least 1 occupational course, and about 4 in 10 students take at least 3 full-year classes. Nationwide, more than 15 million high school and post-secondary students are currently enrolled in CTE courses, and more than half of high school graduates who participate in CTE today now go on to some form of post-secondary education. To be fair, the uneven quality of career and technical education is one reason CTE fails to receive the attention it deserves. The shortcomings of the old vocational education system are well known, and unfortunately, many of them still persist today. Too often, vocational programs have perpetuated inequality. We all know that when there were 2 tracks, students of color and those growing up on the wrong side of the tracks were often more likely to be pushed into the work track and far less likely to get access to the college-ready track. Many programs were considered to be dumping grounds for students who were tracked with weaker academic skills or behavioral challenges. Technical education was typically focused on a relatively small number of program areas and failed to provide adequate student work-based experience or quality internships. Voc Ed lacked academic rigor and relevance. It was often a last-stop destination rather than serving as a launching pad to post-secondary education and industry-recognized certifications leading to a good job and a good career. At the same time, career guidance and counseling in the vocational education system was too often poor or simply non-existent. Many training facilities and labs were run down instead of state-of-the-art. High school vocational programs often had ill-defined or ineffective articulation agreements with 2-year colleges and trade schools. I'm glad you're going to be discussing that today. Business partnerships designed to define industry-recognized credentials and provide internships and training programs were spotty. These challenges are very real to me, and as Bob said, I saw them firsthand when I ran the Chicago Public Schools. Our CTE programs were absolutely stuck in their programmatic silos. Capital programs were not aligned with actual program needs. We literally had culinary equipment sitting on the roof of a school for years unused because the internal plumbing, electrical, and carpentry work hadn't been aligned with the use of Perkins dollars used to acquire that equipment. So we launched an overhaul of Chicago's CTE programs. To date, CPS has closed 50 low-performing CTE programs citywide. In their place, the Chicago Public Schools built 12 college and career academy sites modeled after high-performing career and training academies that have flourished in other cities. The Chicago Public Schools also put $8 million into funding new labs and upgrading existing labs. The district didn't stop there. We set out to develop 40 standardized curriculums over 4 years that integrated core academics and employability skills and were aligned with industry and post-secondary standards. The 10 new curriculums implemented by CPS last year included IT game programming, early childhood education, and broadcast technology. And CPS launched a novel employability assessment last fall that assesses student skills in areas like problem-solving abilities, work ethic, and computer literacy. Perhaps most important, we tried to make CTE a program of choice. We established a citywide admissions policy for our CTE programs. And last year, out-of-area students accounted for 3/4, 75% of admission offers accepted by students. Like every other big city district, Chicago's CTE system still has a long, long way to go. But it is trying to make that transition to CTE 2.0. The number of industry certifications earned by CTE students in Chicago nearly tripled from 2008 to 2010, going from less than 1,000 students to almost 2,800. Internships citywide increased by about 1/3 during that same time. And the percentage of eligible programs offering certification jumped from 40% to 60%. Most important, the percentage of CTE graduates enrolled in college rose 2.3 percentage points during the most recent school year. In fact, and this is a fascinating stat, CTE graduates in Chicago today are slightly more likely to enroll in college and be employed than other CPS graduates. At the national level, our vision for transforming CTE contains a number of the elements that Chicago and other districts have begun to put in place. But our goals are even more ambitious. In the new CTE, we are all working towards all CTE programs would serve as viable and rigorous pathways to post-secondary and career success. Career pathways now spelled out in the rigorous programs with study initiative would span secondary and post-secondary education by design and concentrate much more on high-demand, high-wage occupations. Statewide articulation agreements must become the norm. Employers must be much more engaged in designing programs of study and promoting stackable, industry-recognized credentials. And instead of applying the RPOS framework to just a few CTE initiatives, we would like to see it applied to many more Perkins-funded CTE programs. In short, the mission moving forward here is to refine and scale what works. And as your report spells out, there are great models of the new CTE succeeding all across the country, from the Career Academy movement to Project Lead the Way's Pathway to Engineering curriculum to Wisconsin's Youth Apprenticeship program. Northern Virginia Community College, as you'll hear shortly, has started an early college CTE academy that allows students to graduate with an associate's degree in year 13 of school. They are working with schools as early as 8th grade to get students more interested in STEM careers. The United States absolutely has much to learn from other high-performing countries about strengthening and modernizing career and technical education. But one of my favorite examples of the new CTE program is homegrown. It comes from the Washington State, where the Granite Falls High School shop girls built homemade cars focused on fuel-efficient designs. They designed a diesel-powered vehicle that got a staggering 470 miles per gallon. They called their car the Iron Maiden. And you won't be surprised to hear that the Iron Maiden won the diesel fuel design competition and the significant cash reward that went with it. These exemplary programs are absolutely changing students' lives for the better. MDRC conducted a rigorous, randomized assessment of the nation's career academies and found that they boosted young men's earnings by 17%, or nearly $30,000 over 8 years. But the new CTE is still largely confined to islands of excellence. We want that success to become the norm. We want rigor and relevance. Our nation's high schools must be a springboard to higher education and post-secondary training, not a dead end. I am admittedly impatient for reform, but patience is not called for in the face of real opportunity gaps. As all of you know, our students today get just one chance at a quality education. They cannot wait for reform. It's time to finish the transformation of the old vocational education system into the new CTE. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
I'm Jan Bray with the Association for Career and Technical Education. So certainly we appreciate what you're saying and agree with what this report says and certainly what you are, and we think we are seeing a transformation in CTE. My question is, after hearing you, is how is the Department of Education, the administration, what changes are you going to make in your messages and your language so that schools looking now focused on just academics because of accountability, it's pushed out CTE, it's pushed out the ability to do reform. So how can that be changed and how can you lead that change?
Well, we're trying, we'll continue to try to do that. I think, again, these are often false choices. It's been this either or, and to me it's both and. And Bob started his remarks with a comment that we have about a 25% dropout rate in our country. And I think if we find ways to better engage our students, if they're not bored, they'll stay in school. I think the CTE programs are a hugely undertapped resource, underutilized strategy to keep students in school. So I don't see this again as conflict. I think strong CTE programs will lead to better academic results, will lead to higher graduation rates and more students having real options going forward. And I think the more we can do to highlight those places that are doing this well, where students are going on to be successful, and frankly challenging the status quo when folks are still stuck in the past. And we're going to do everything we can, both from the bully pulpit and using our resources to do those two things.
Mr. Duncan, in terms of minorities, the criticism is going to come back that again, tracking is going to come back into vogue. How would you answer that? And in terms of Hispanics and other minorities, blacks, how quickly can you implement this type of program, technical program, in metropolitan areas?
So I tried to say a couple times this can't be either or. It can't be either going to college or going on a career track. It's got to be both and. And where you have high schools that are providing that array of opportunities and students figure out what their passion is, what they enjoy doing, then they have both options. I would argue as a country we're not doing nearly enough of both, of either. We don't have nearly enough students who are college ready. We don't have nearly enough students that are career ready. So these things I think are false dichotomies, are false choices. And again, I think they're mutually reinforcing. The skills you need to be successful in these two paths are very, very similar. We need to better engage students. We need to add rigor. We need to better challenge students. And this is not about tracking or shunting certain students off in one direction. It's about giving a much more robust, well-rounded set of options to every single child and letting them choose their path. And again, if you look at two-year universities today, four-year institutions, students are 25, 26, 27, 28, 35. Many students are working and going to school at the same time. That's just the reality today. Much fewer students today just four-year full-time in school than in the past. And so the world's changed. I think CTE has been a little slow together to evolve, and I think this report and other things can help to spark that change that will give much better outcomes for all students, including Black and Latino children.
Excuse me. Can we microphone?
What do you anticipate as some of the changes that can help support this vision?
Well, probably won't happen this year. We got a couple of things cooking. Brenda and our team is going to work hard on this. But I think just anything we can do to reinforce this goal of excellence, that these programs, I think, when they're done well, can be life transforming for students. And I think in some places Perkins dollars have been used very well. In other places they frankly haven't been. Anything we can do to shine a spotlight where these programs, where these dollars are making a huge difference in students' lives, changing outcomes, changing their life chances. We want to do more of that. Where things aren't working, we want to take a bit of a hard line there.
What do you see the role of for-profit colleges, career colleges? I know a lot of them feel under attack right now, and there has been a lot of abuses, but it does seem to be a little war between the public and private colleges and the for-profits.
So again, I'm also saying I think these are false wars or false choices or false if we're going to hit the president's goal of leading the world in college graduates by 2020, we need everybody doing more. We need 2 years, we need 4 years, nonprofit, private, for-profit, doesn't matter to me. What we want is just really good outcomes. And so we're working hard to make sure we reward the vast majority of for-profits that are doing a great job, often helping folks who have struggled and had some challenging times get back on their feet and re-enter the economy with new skills. Where you have folks that have sort of abused that privilege and taken tax dollars and not used them well. And saddled folks with debt that they can't begin to afford. We want to challenge that, and we're working very, very hard and trying to be very thoughtful of hitting that fine line of rewarding success, but also not tolerating the bad actors. Yeah, last one.
Hi, Natalia Gonzalez from Hispanic Link. It's apparent that motivation is an issue when it comes to high school and college. Now, are there any plans of bilingual education motivating, like specifically Hispanic students? Is there any plan for bilingual education?
We're actually big fans of bilingual education, and I'd go so far it's got to be trilingual education. In a globally competitive, again, flat world, our students today who don't speak multiple languages are at a competitive disadvantage. So it's not just about Hispanic students or teaching Spanish. It's about giving our students a range of different opportunities. Pretty soon there are going to be more English speakers in China than in the United States. And they're far ahead of us in thinking about this in a global way. I think our country's been too parochial. So we're trying to do a lot to promote the study of foreign languages, to expand them. And whether it's Chinese, or Mandarin, whether it's Arabic, whether it's Spanish, whatever it might be, we have to provide a lot more of those opportunities. And I would just say at the early grades. It's so much easier to learn those languages as babies than when you get older. Thanks for having me today, Bob. Thank you for all your leadership. Really appreciate the opportunity.
That was really terrific. Let me ask the panel, please, to come up and take their places. In the interest of time, I'll simply point you to the fact that you have bios of each of these folks in your book. But we are really fortunate to be joined by, starting from the far end, Bob Templin, president of Northern Virginia Community College; Stan Litow, vice president and president of the foundation at the IBM Corporation, and a longtime colleague and worker in this field; and Andres Alonso, CEO of the Baltimore Public Schools. My colleague Bill Simons is going to moderate the panel, and I just want to say a word of thanks to Bill. When Ron Ferguson and I were organizing this project, we made a decision right at the beginning that we wanted to produce a report that people would read, which ruled out the typical academic report, and we hired a journalist to be our kind of project director, and Bill spent the last couple of years moving around the country talking with folks in the field, and most of the words and some of the ideas in the report really are Bill's. So Bill, thank you, and take over.
Well, I'd like to thank our panel again this morning for coming out to participate in this discussion. And we chose this panel deliberately to reflect three key sectors that really have to play a major role if we're going to create better pathways to prosperity. Certainly our nation's high schools play a major role in that. Our community colleges, as we point out, really have a central role to play. And finally, and perhaps most important, our nation's employers really have to be engaged. So I'd like to ask each panelist to talk about what role they can play, not only at their institution, but in the broader sector they represent, and how they can work together. And I'd like to start with Andres Alonso, representing the Baltimore Public Schools. You know, the Pathways Challenge is particularly present in our nation's urban schools, unfortunately. So many children who go to urban schools come out of there totally unprepared, and they don't go on to lead a successful life as adults. So I'm wondering what potential you see for improving career and technical education and other pathways opportunities, how that could help reduce the dropout rate and increase success in Baltimore and other urban schools.
Well, first, let me just say that I don't see this as CTE 2.0. I see this as CTE 2.3, 2.4, in that the number of slots or seats in career and technical / vocational education was severely reduced between the 1990s and the past few years. And the nature of the programs, even though many programs, as we just heard from Arne, were very resilient in terms of their nature, the nature of the programs changed significantly in places like New York City and places like Baltimore. Secondly, I'm intrigued by the reaction to the report as a return to tracking, because tracking has never really gone away. You can't have conversations about dropout factories and not recognize that entire schools serve as forms of tracking, entire systems serve as forms of tracking, especially with the increasing segregation in American inner schools. So what are we really talking about? And one of the reasons why I endorsed the report is because I think it has its feet firmly planted on the ground. The third thing that I wanted to comment in terms of the role of the K-12 schools is that this conversation deeply resonates in the communities that I serve. It's not new. It's not an underrepresented conversation. In a city that historically has had a dropout rate of roughly 50%, people debate about the numbers, but we know the numbers are huge. Where the commercial and industrial infrastructure has eroded extraordinarily over decades. I mean, I serve a city that has lost 400,000 people over 4 decades. There are no jobs, and there are no jobs for kids. So the demand of the communities is not necessarily you're tracking our kids. The demand is very strongly, how are you preparing our kids so that they survive, they have a future, they have options. And there are many constraints in the conversation shaped by, as was referred earlier, accountability systems that push schools in certain directions, bureaucracies that refuse to change, funding streams that are not necessarily aligned with what needs to happen, many, many constraints, the capacity of people to really move ahead of the need as opposed to continually anchoring themselves in all needs. But we have seen it, as Arne said it, as a both-and conversation rather than as either-or. So as an example, we have doubled the number of AP offerings, but we have also doubled the number of career and technical offerings. Participation in career and technical programs has grown by almost 40%. And as we have closed schools, we have closed schools with career and technical offerings, but created new schools that have them as well. So when I arrived in Baltimore, there were 23 schools that provided offerings. We're now up to 33, and since most of the schools that we have opened are secondary schools that have a 6 to 12 configuration, we have, in essence, put our hooks in early on the kids. What we're finding is that these programs have a huge role in creating that engagement that we've been talking about. The dropout incidence in CTE concentrations in Baltimore City was less than 1% last year. And we've had an enormous success over the past 3 years in reducing the incidence of dropouts. But there's a real evidence base for us that getting the kids engaged and getting the families engaged in the work has extraordinary potential. The greatest challenge for me is, leaving aside issues of resources, etc., which always matter, is the shift in the civic conversation that is highlighted in the report, which is very much tied to cultural frames around what's happening in inner cities with alignment to what's happening in higher ed, and also the willingness of the business community to shift its practices so that we have places to put the kids so that the work is not simply about the classroom. I mean, even in that score, we have nearly triple participation in work-based experiences. But it's a daily fight with kind of one-off wins and losses rather than a systemic approach to the work. And I think that this has to be systemic, that we're not going to get any movement out of remaking CTE if it's not part of I'll use holistic in a different way, a holistic approach to reform, which is about a real conversation about what accountability means, what support means, what it means to create a new school in terms of access and in terms of the instructional program, and also how we define success in terms of what happens after kids graduate from 12th grade. So I think we have a huge role to play in the conversation, but it's a role that we need to play as one sector that feeds a larger conversation about the future of our kids.
Well, Andres, thank you very much for those inspiring remarks. As I was listening to you, I was reminded that one of the ideas we started with, because people have raised the issue of tracking, is that the most pernicious form of tracking in America is the high school dropout problem. If you're a high school dropout, you really don't have a future in the 21st century, and we have to recognize and deal with that problem. And now I'd like to turn to Bob Templin. He's president of one of the most innovative and successful community colleges in America, really a model for what community colleges can and should be. And he's already launched 3 initiatives that relate directly to some of the ideas in this report. So I'd like to ask you, Bob, to tell us about the work you're doing at NOVA in that regard.
Sure. Thank you very much. And my thanks to the American Youth Policy Forum for creating the venue for today's discussion, and to the Harvard Graduate School of Education for once again raising this issue and bringing it to the forefront. NOVA is Virginia's largest institution of higher education. We offer the first 2 years of the lower division undergraduate program, and we offer career and technical education and workforce training. This year we'll enroll about 78,000 students. It's clear from our experience that the majority of young people that are completing high school are not ready either to participate at the college level or ready to go into the workforce or to be trained for the workforce. And so for the past 6 years, NOVA has been working to change this equation by in effect, creating new systems that cross boundaries. Those 4 elements are higher education, the school system, employers, and community-based nonprofit organizations. And I'm going to talk about several of those that we've started with very promising successes. As you heard Secretary Duncan talk about, our partnership with our public schools is very deep. We've removed the barrier or the line between post-secondary education and secondary education by integrating our programs with the school systems and becoming involved in the schools while students are still high school students, and we help them progress while they're in school to do college-level work where they can and earn college credit while they're still in high school, seeing themselves as being post-secondary students before they leave, and also to become more aware of career opportunities in a very rapidly changing environment. So some of those take the form of a dual enrollment. Some of those take the place of our working to test students to see if they're college ready and to help provide remediation for those that are not while they're still in school. And some of those are through early college, where we've worked with our schools to create a 13th year, not 12 at the high school, 1 at the college, but an integrated academy where students are capable of completing their high school diploma and their associate degree simultaneously. Just to give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about, we're now working with 37 high schools. The broad scheme or strategy that we have is also called the Pathway Strategy. It's 37 high schools. 93% of our students that we work with meet the federal definition of an at-risk students, and we have an 84% success rate among students who are in our system that complete high school and go on to post-secondary education. This is in a population that normally would be predicted at less than 20%. Once at NOVA, their persistent and graduation rates at NOVA are twice that of our normal student population. This is an at-risk population, and they're performing twice as well as the normal or more traditional form of our population. So that's one example of this notion of integrating systems. The second example is in the area of working with community-based organizations. We believe that we have to create alternative routes to traditional school and college-based programs for students that don't see themselves going to college or even liking school. So two examples that I'm going to give that I think have national potential. One is a type of apprentice program. It's called Year Up. Year Up is headquartered in Boston. I believe they have 8 programs now. NOVA's working with them creating a post-secondary element. This is a program for youth that are 18 to 24 years old who graduated from high school, don't see themselves going to college, and have no plans to enter the workforce or have no skills to enter the workforce with family-sustaining wages. They're drifting. They are a lot of the majority, the forgotten majority that we're talking about. Year Up, which is a national nonprofit organization, it's located in 8 cities, provides an intensive year-long apprenticeship program. The first 6 months is classroom-based. It is not at a school. It's in a place of business. They want students to see themselves as being in a professional environment. They offer programs in financial services and also information technology. They work with 100 different employers, some of which are Fortune 500 companies, and they provide corporate paid internships for 6 months so that at the completion of the Year Up, students have learned basic skills for entering a field. They have a job with an employer that will encourage them to continue their education and showing them the value of doing that. But the new element that we've integrated is that they're integrated now with us, and so when they complete the program, they've completed 18 college credits toward an associate degree. They have a job and an employer that's urging them to continue their post-secondary credential. More than 90% of these kids complete the program, and 3/4 gain full-time employment with an average wage of $15 an hour. The second one that I want to identify, and one that has enormous potential nationwide, is a partnership between Goodwill Industries and America's community colleges. It's called the Community College Career Collaboration, in which we currently are launching 30 community colleges and Goodwill partners in metropolitan areas across the nation to provide workplace job training for those who don't have a post-secondary credential, typically from low-income communities, to provide them not only the job skills, but again, once again, the college credit that gets them to see themselves as post-secondary students. These are mostly people that thought they had no chance, no future to ever go to a post-secondary institution. Training programs are typically at the Goodwill site in communities where people feel safe rather than at a college or university, which is very, very foreign. But by the time the program is over, there is no doubt in these folks' minds that they are capable of doing college-level work. They can learn skills that will get them family-sustainable wages, and they're capable. They see themselves as capable of finishing a post-secondary credential. So my message is we're not going to solve this problem with everyone staying neatly in their place, playing by the rules. We've got to break down barriers, and we have to create new systems. In fact, one of our newest beginning in middle school, is called Systemic Solutions, with the emphasis on systemic solutions, where employers, middle schools, high schools, colleges, universities, and nonprofits are teaming together to allow young people to achieve at levels that we never thought were possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those remarks. And I'd like to turn to Stan Litow. You know, we're really fortunate to have Stan here. More than almost anybody else in corporate America, he's been involved in the effort to improve education for many years. He was, as Bob mentioned, a key member of the effort to standards-based reform, which ultimately led to the passage of No Child Left Behind. And IBM has always been on the front edges of trying to innovate education. A few years ago, they had a program called Reinventing Education, which was trying to use their enormous computing powers to try to figure out ways to improve schools. Now, IBM has just recently announced they're going to create a new school, which is going to allow students to go from grade 9 to 14, come out really equipped to work at places like IBM, really great, what we'd call middle skills jobs. I'd like to ask Stan to tell us about the role, what IBM is doing, but also to ask a question that troubles all of us who are concerned about this, which is how can we get more employers engaged in this important work and following the example of IBM?
Okay. Let me start with congratulating the authors of the report. I think this is a really good job, not just framing the issue and identifying some of the solutions, but pointing a way that people could work more constructively together to be able to solve these problems. You know, I have been in the private sector now for quite some time. I was Deputy Chancellor of Schools in New York City for quite some time. I worked for the mayor for a period of time. And I also worked in the not-for-profit sector running a think tank and produced a lot of public policy reports. And at one point took a look back in New York City over a 40-year period and tried to figure out why don't the recommendations of policy reports get implemented. And as you look back, you could clearly determine that if the recommendations were specific, if it was clear who was accountable to do something different, if it was clear what the existing barriers are that stand in the way of a reform taking place, and if it was clear, was there a monitoring system in place to make sure that progress would in fact take place, those kinds of recommendations and those kinds of reports had a much better chance of success. So I think as we look to reports, and this one's a really good one, the next steps are difficult and they're all ahead of us, and I think collaborating and working together we could be successful. So hats off to the report. Now, I'm here representing not all companies, but one company, IBM, but it's a big company, and we're celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. It's tough for a technology company to stay in business for 100 years. That's why there's only one. But we have 400,000 employees. It's a $100 billion company, and we do business in 170 different countries. And I think the private sector should recognize that if we're going to be successful, we're all in a war for talent, and that it's not going to be possible to be successful if you don't spend a fair amount of time thinking about how to improve education. And that's a real challenge. It's not a challenge only for educators. It's a collaborative challenge for people at the K-12 level, people at the higher education level, and we as employers. We spent a lot of time looking at what we could do to improve education. We developed a new early childhood learning center, which we contributed to about 45,000 of these learning centers around the world, and that was at a time when most early childhood educators didn't want technology anywhere near a classroom. Thank God we've moved away from that and figured out how to do it and how to do it in an effective way. We've also looked a lot at language issues and language translation, developed high-quality automatic language translation, English to Spanish, bilingual email. The work that we did on English to Arabic automatic translation is being used extensively right now by a whole range of organizations who really need to know what people who speak Arabic and not English are thinking and what they're saying. And we've also spent a lot of time on the STEM issue, creating a site on the web called tryscience.org, which has content from science centers to be able to give teachers, parents, and students a better crack at understanding how to incorporate science into your classroom. But this challenge is one, you talked about starting a new school. Yes, we announced, actually Mayor Bloomberg announced that IBM, the Department of Education, and the City University of New York are working on a new model, a grade 9 through 14 school. But it's not just about one school. The one school, which will start in September, will be a 9 through 14 school. Students will graduate at the end of their 14th year with an associate's degree and be first in line for jobs at IBM and hopefully other companies that require people with a range of skills. But it's not about building one good school, because there are a lot of good schools. And when I was Deputy Chancellor in New York, we started a bunch of small schools, and it's spiraled in New York City and around the country. But building a new school doesn't necessarily transform all the other schools. So we have to look at what are the core elements in this 9 to 14 school, and how can you embed it in a new strategy going beyond one school to many. I think first, it's not only about CTE. It's not a set of schools. It's really thinking about the problem that we've got. In New York City, the City University, I think, has 21 or 22% of the students who enroll in community college get an associate's degree within a 6-year period. So that's not just CTE. That's about all the students who enter into community colleges. The chances of them completing are low. And we think by connecting K-12 and through grade 14 in a more effective way, we could perhaps get larger numbers of students to get those degrees. So that's one element of the program. And the department has selected a guy who will be the principal of this one school who's absolutely first class, and that's terrific. The second element is some work on the curriculum side. And we will be putting together a consortia of information technology companies to look at the skill and the opportunities for people. What kinds of skills do young people need to have to be successful in jobs in our industry? And it's also not just our industry, because all of our business partners, all of our suppliers need people with the same set of skills. So don't think about this as just information technology or CTE. These are skills that people have to become employable. So the curriculum work is particularly important. The professional development work with teachers is critically important. When we were putting this concept together, we looked at some of the best performing STEM high schools in the United States, and while they're in a variety of different states, they're all over the place. They have some very consistent common elements. Cooperative education built into the program, extended learning time programs, strong professional development. So you don't have to go looking for the 1,000 different things that one could do. The common core elements are very, very similar, high-performing institution to another. And we're very anxious to work with the City University and make sure that not just one community college, because we'll be matching up with one in Brooklyn, is involved in this process, but that all the community colleges are brought to the table and all the high schools are brought to the table so that this can be an effective solution. We've been using some of our data analytics software to look at the community college students in New York City where the dropout rates are so high. And we came to the conclusion, looking at their data, that there are 6 or 7 common elements. If they're at place with an entry-level student in a community college, the chances are 99% they're not going to finish the first semester. So you don't have to look at this as a large problem. The data and the analysis of the data can break it down to you so you can figure out how to intervene with the students who need the most help and not leave them aside. How you can intervene in different ways with students who need different kinds of help, because we're not going to have all the resources that we need to solve this problem, so we're going to have to be smarter about it. The other thing about what we're doing in this grade 9 to 14 model is not to do it only in New York City, but to make sure that all the information and all the material is freely available to people online so that any school could take the information and material, adapt it to its own purpose, make its own model, and do something effective in their way. I think the bottom line is business community desperately needs change. Businesses that don't change don't stay in business. That's the competition that's fierce out there, and people simply will not survive. Those who do change, and change in a systemic way, are those that succeed and are successful. And I think the message is the same for all of us in these 3 elements. We've got to change. We've got to learn to do things differently. We can't operate in silos. We have to find ways to work collaboratively together. And I think that this report is a good beginning. So we're excited about it, and I look forward to answering any other questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Now we're going to move to the final portion of our program, which is going to be to get you and the audience involved. Bob is going to come up here and take my seat. I'm going to field the questions. And I'd like everybody, if you've got a question, and I call on you to identify yourself, the organization you represent, And then in the interest of time and to allow a lot of people to get involved, we're going to ask just one person on the panel to answer each question most likely. Okay, so who would like to pose the first question? Yes.
Hi, thanks so much. Peg Walton with Corporate Voices for Working Families. And I wanted to ask Stan, congratulations that IEBM is leading this piece that they are, and with hiring, with having 400,000 employees, obviously you have a large job bank to draw them into. But how are you engaging other corporations and other employers to be a part of that?
I'm glad you asked that question because we've been doing a lot of thinking about how to do that in the most constructive way. In the fall, looking at the jobs crisis in the United States, we came to the conclusion that the things that big companies could do to generate economic growth in the small business sector is to open up our supply chain spending, buy more goods and services from small companies, and we created something called Supplier Connection and brought together 7 companies. They're very different companies with one common way of getting a small business to become a supplier so you can qualify. One, Supplier Connection is a live free site right now. The 7 companies have $150 billion worth of combined spending, and we combined the criteria to be a supplier to IBM, Bank of America, Citi, Pfizer, etc. That was a model for getting companies to work together on something that they never worked together on, which is how do you qualify a small business to become a supplier, even though 95% of what they asked for was the same. So we're applying that same concept here. We believe for jobs that pay more than $40,000 a year at our company that require a 2-year AA degree, the same is true of a variety of other companies. So we're bringing together the same kind of a consortia to begin the process of saying that when you finish this program, if the curriculum looked the following way, the skills were the following way, you ought to be able to be first in line for a job not just at IBM, but for these other companies. And the technology makes it easier for the companies to work together. The problem up until now is that's all been in the private sector. The people in the K-12 sector and in higher ed haven't had access to all of that information. Now we're going to use the technology to make it easier for people as opposed to wondering or be out of date on what they know and what people need to have.
Do we have another question?
Hi, I'm Sharon Thomas Parrott from DeVry Inc. and the DeVry Foundation and a funder of this fantastic report, so thank you very much. My question is for Dr. Alonso, and it goes back to something that Secretary Duncan said about academic rigor and career readiness being the same and not different. And I think one of the challenges we have is in teacher education programs and with teachers on the ground, counselors on the ground, who view academic programs differently than career skills necessary to go to work. How do we put some emphasis on retraining teachers and administrators in K-12 to embrace the idea that you won't have a successful CTE graduate unless there's academic rigor?
Well, thank you for your question. The interesting thing for me in that discussion is that there has been an increase in rigor in CTE programs. And what we found in Baltimore, what I found in Baltimore, was not that the programs have no rigor, because many of the programs that had no rigor have gone away. It's the contrary, is the fact that many of those programs now have entry criteria that, because they're tied to accountability standards, and schools are notoriously horrible about using every perverse incentive for certain reasons. So we have many, many children who are in danger of dropping out of schools, And kids drop out of school for 4 or 5 reasons. They're overage, they get pushed out, they fail in the 9th grade, they have family circumstances. Many of those kids are the kids who can't get into the CTE programs that would hook them. So the biggest, at some level, we always have to figure out what's the biggest lever and what's the definition of the problem. The definition of the problem for me is not about a lack of rigor, because the way we're moving right now, especially with exit criteria from high schools, which extend to all students, if the students are not getting their academics, they're not graduating from high school. So it's less about the issue of the rigor. It's about, and Maryland, for example, has 4 end-of-high school tests that were introduced 2 years ago. So, that's not the conversation. The conversation is, why don't these tests are aligned with the tests that the community colleges and the 4-year colleges provide? So why does one of my kids who passes an end-of-high school exam in an area then fail the entry test to a community college class? I mean, that's the real conversation for us. So that's one part of it. The other part of it, which is about the question of capacity, that's what we struggle with across the board, which is the notion of, do our teachers actually know the standards, and do they have the right performance standards? Because part of what we also see are kids who pass academic courses and then can pass these courses that we're talking about. So we're not struggling with that question. We're struggling with other questions in the conversation.
Over there.
Hi, Rebecca Thesson, Assistant Professor of Educational Administration at George Washington. And this question's for Dr. Alonso. You started your remarks saying that tracking still exists in schools, that some schools are succeeding more than others. And I'm curious to know more about what you're doing to ensure that the reforms that you do put in place in Baltimore are implemented in schools across the district, because much of whether a reform is successful or not is really determined by school leadership. So are there particular ways in which you're trying to support school leaders in being successful, and are there things we can do at the university level to partner with districts and ensuring that success?
That's the $1 million question, because we're all trying to do exactly the same thing, and it's funny how the playbook is so similar across many districts that tout themselves as leading reform, and part of what we find is that leaders change, superintendents come and go, and the practices remain. So, part of my ambition is to make sure that if I ever leave, no one can say that I came and went. So I see this as systemic, Rebecca. I don't see it as an initiative. I mean, look, 75% of my principals are new since I arrived in the district, and I've only been there 3.5 years. Yeah, and I had something to do with it. We've closed 26 schools, we've opened 16 schools. The number of terminations of teachers doubled in the last 3 years from 3 years before. So systemically, it's about many things. It's about defining content, defining accountability, engaging parents in the question of accountability. We don't have these discussions in middle-class communities because you have a huge accountability pool, which is about making sure that you don't treat somebody's child different than you would treat your own. That's the same conversation for us, and there are elements of the work that make me feel really good about what that means, as in, there's been this huge reduction in the number of dropouts, and, we had 600 more kids applied to college by January 12th this year than the year before. That's traction on a very important metric that's not necessarily about NCLB compliance. But so much of this work is about how we replicate inequality in communities and schools, that it's going to take quite a bit of time. I'm going to add to my fellow ex-deputy chancellor in New York City's list of ways in which reports live on. And unfortunately, I will add to the list of bullets, if it creates jobs for bureaucrats and school systems, it lives on. Those are the hardest programs to cut. So, Bob, that will be a recommendation for your next report.
Yes, question back there.
Yes, I'm Barry Stern of the affiliated with the Haberman Educational Foundation. And first, let me commend all the panelists for very creative efforts to bridge these gaps and to get the forgotten half back in the mainstream. But my question really is to Robert Schwartz, because I've been in this business for many years, and I'm kind of asking the question, why now and what's new? These remarks could have been made perhaps 20 years ago, and it's always been about the demand, really. I mean, getting companies to really act proactively, work, and I think the community college has done a wonderful job with this. But what is really new about this report compared to what you might have found 20 years ago? And how is the European model something that you think this country can learn from?
Yeah, it's funny. I sent a copy to a friend who I actually did some work with back in the Clinton administration. He was working in Secretary Reich's office, and I was doing some work out of the Education Secretary's office. And I told him to file the report under Bob Schwartz, recidivist, since a lot of us have been working on these issues for a very long time. I think what's the current moment, I think, really does represent some opportunities that really haven't been here before. One piece of the puzzle is, I think it is now increasingly clear to us, because of PISA and because of a more international way of looking at the world, that we can't afford not to look outward and to realize that we are in a more global economy, and that while we have stood still around high school attainment and college attainment, that others have moved past us rapidly. And I think that, as I said in introducing the Secretary, he in particular, it's probably not well known here, but when the OECD Secretary General came back in March to ask our Secretary if he would be willing to host the release of the 2009 PISA results, Duncan said yes, but with one condition. Would OECD be willing to commission a report that would take us past the horse race numbers and really help explain to us what is it that the highest performing countries actually have done? What policies and practices have led to persistently high performance? And Mark Tucker, who's somewhere in this room here, was the person that OECD turned to kind of organize a volume. When the PISA results were released, the Secretary General at the same time handed Duncan this report. I never can remember what came before the colon in the title, but after the colon was Lessons for the U.S. And Arne said at the time he was up half the night before reading it, and knowing him a bit, I can believe that. So that's a piece of it. But I also just think, for a lot of the reasons that Stan cited, I think far-sighted employers really do understand the degree to which their self-interest is absolutely linked to the ability of the education system to produce people who have the skills that are needed. And I think it's increasingly clear that the education system by itself, Andres, great as he is, by himself is not going to solve this problem. Bob Templin, great as he is not by himself going to solve this problem. And I think we are in an environment where it's become more possible. I'll make one more commercial, and that is that actually on Friday, a recently appointed White House Council for Community Solutions is having its first meeting. This was a council appointed by the President in mid-December. Patty Stonecipher, formerly the leader of the Gates Foundation, is chairing it. It's got a very impressive roster of 20 people drawn from across the sectors. Its charge is to figure out how to build more collaboration across sectors at the community level to take on tough problems and challenges. Through nothing that we did, a draft of this report came across Patty's desk. She kind of grabbed onto it, and it it looks as if this council is going to make a central piece of its work trying to figure out how to actually move the kind of core ideas of this report forward at the community level. And I think that's, again, one more kind of symptom, if you will, of the fact that the political environment may be a bit more open now than it was in earlier times. The other ironic comment I'd make is that I actually think that the stress under which public institutions are now going to be operating for the foreseeable future, given the financial crisis, also creates a kind of an opportunity to actually think about doing business in a somewhat different fashion. So that's the reasons for, at least for me. This is, my wife keeps telling me, is this the fourth time around for you on these issues? And the answer is yeah, and I think it's pretty clearly the last time around. So I'm hoping this time around we get a bit more traction.
Mark?
Mark Tucker, National Center on Education and the Economy. I, too, have a question for you, Bob. And it's actually another way of asking the last question. You and I and others have spent many years now studying other countries. And when we study those countries, what we study is their systems. When we come back to the United States, we have discussions like the one we've had this morning. I was enormously impressed by Bob Templin, Stan Litauen, and Andreas Alonso. What they are describing are truly impressive initiatives, which is what we do in the United States. We have programs, and it has never been hard to identify a few individuals who have made an enormous difference. What we do not have is what we find in other countries, systems. And so I wonder if you might take a minute to distill this report from the standpoint of what might be the key features of a system that we would put in place so we do not constantly think about the next program that we hope somehow will multiply.
That's a little above my pay grade, but let me try a bit. Let me first say it's interesting when Stan was making his wonderful comment of the kind of criteria for deciding which reports live and which ones die. I was thinking, gee, maybe I made a wrong decision. But I, against the advice of my two colleagues, resisted the temptation to end the report the way a lot of reports end, by saying the federal government must do this, states must do that, school districts must do this, employers must do that, in part because we thought that the most important role the report could play is really trying to trigger a serious conversation about the consequences of considering down the path we're on. On the system building side, I mean, obviously, we're a big, diverse country. Every one of these countries that whose systems I cite with approval, they're the equivalent of our individual states. And I think one of our challenges is trying to figure out what realistically can you do at the national level to put in place the elements of a real system? Beginning with, I know there was another recent call, I believe, from ACT to create a set of national industry standards that might be the counterpart on the work skill side of the Common Core academic standards. I think, great idea. I look at Mark because Mark served on the National Skills Standards Board the last time around on this. So this time around, I'm for kind of starting at the kind of regional labor market level and trying to work up rather than trying to start at the, quote, national level and work down, which is one reason that I'm hoping that this new White House Council will actually put some muscle behind the idea of finding some regional, for some regions and communities to really start moving this conversation. But you're right. We all said to ourselves, on the prep call, we got to move from program to system. And I think in each of them, in their own way, made that comment during the session. And if we knew, what the recipe was for getting there, we would have laid it out in the report. Maybe if this report actually has the impact we hope it has, the next report can begin to talk about some of the elements of what that system must look like.
We have time maybe for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Peggy Orchowski. I'm a congressional reporter for the Hispanic Outlook on Higher Education. I have two questions. Stan, I was wondering, how is IBM, how are you paying for this? Is this a philanthropic project, a foundation project? Is it considered a business investment? And also wondered that missing from a lot of the conversation here is a linkage with government money, government programs. Is there a role for government money in this, or are you trying to avoid that?
I'll start off with how are we paying for it. We're paying for certain things from a philanthropic expense. We're paying for certain things from a HR standpoint in terms of improving our, HR systems. With most of the things that we do, there's a connection between social purpose and business purpose. When I talked to you earlier about the supply chain issue, I mean, obviously that's something that we would start off creating as a philanthropic expense, but if we wind up getting a large number of small businesses who are very good suppliers and have a lot of creativity and innovation, that enriches our company from a business standpoint. If we create a grid project to drive cancer research, we might wind up with intellectual capital that we could apply elsewhere. So I think if companies think strategically about what they do in communities, I'll give you another example. We created a program at IBM called Personal Learning Accounts. So all of our U.S. employees can actually contribute funds into an account that we will match so that they can have the funding resources to get further education. Not job-related, which the company should pay for, but if it's personal-related, it should be shared. So I think this isn't philanthropy solely. This is something where companies, I think that we talked earlier about the moment. There was a report released recently that we led the nation in the company that had the most jobs at $40,000 and above, if you looked on the web, that we're looking for people to hire. If we're looking to be competitive, we can't transport all of our jobs elsewhere. We really need these systems to work, and it's not philanthropy alone that's going to get up there. I think philanthropy should be more than spare change. It should be real change, but it should integrate with what the private sector is really about, which is growing jobs in the economy. One last thing on Mark's point. I agree with him absolutely. This should not be about programs. But if you look at change within the private sector, people are always looking to steal the best idea from somebody else and multiply it. It's unique in the public sector that if we have a school or a program that works, people say, oh, that's on a hill, we're in a valley, that's a big school, we're a small school. The U.S. does a very, very good job about bringing the best private sector initiatives to scale. I think if we could get together, we could bring that energy and innovation and creativity to this subject matter.
I just make a comment on the second part of the question. Of course, there's a role for government. I let Arne off a bit easily by focusing mostly on the bully pulpit, which is an important role. But I also think that I would love to see in this arena, in terms of the federal role, an approach, if you will, similar in its boldness and moving to an incentive strategy that is actually more akin to the race to the top strategy than the traditional kind of formula funding. The other thing I would love to see is a strategy that, one of the things that we talked about in the kind of prep call for this panel with both Andres and Bob Templin, talked about the difficulty of doing this kind of collaborative cross-sectoral work given a lot of the limitations of the funding streams, and given that small amounts of money, if we actually had a strategy to pull resources together from workforce development, career and technical education, and a couple of other programs, and actually amass a bit of a pot of innovation money, and then really try to support, think of it as a kind of R&D investment fund to support innovative strategies that have the potential to scale. I think we might be able to get somewhere. Most of the dollars clearly to support this are going to be in the public sector at the state and local level, but there clearly is a role for the private sector. teach a course at the Ed School called School Reform from the Outside In, which focuses on the role of foundations and nonprofits. And the general sort of going-in premise of the course is that although the private dollars, either dollars or services committed from companies or foundations like Stan's or even the Gates Foundation, they're less than 1% of the total dollars that go into particularly the K-12 system. But there's so little flexible money for innovation, for R&D, kind of risk capital to support innovation, that private dollars smartly invested, and I really don't know any foundation, corporate or private, that's been smarter than IBM over the years in using its dollars. Small dollars strategically placed really can drive innovation and change in this sector. And I think in a way, I think of the I3 fund, for example, as really something that actually learned from the private sector. It's no accident that Jim Shelton, who ran that, came out of McKinsey and the New School Venture Fund and the Gates Foundation. But we need more examples like that in a period in which there simply aren't going to be substantial new dollars at the federal level.
Okay, well, in closing, I'd like to thank and explain that this report really was the product of a collaboration among many different organizations who worked with us on developing these ideas. I'd like to thank especially the 7 foundations who contributed to the effort to produce this report. We deliberately had 4 corporate foundations because we recognized from the very beginning it was going to take a lot of employer involvement. Those are Accenture, DeVry, the General Electric Foundation, and Pearson. And Pearson also volunteered to publish the report. So you can thank them for the wonderful job they did on that. We also had 3 nonprofit foundations, the Kellogg Foundation, the Nellie Mae Foundation, and the James Irvine Foundation. And in the back of the report, you're going to see a list of acknowledgments which mention many of the different organizations and people who really contributed a lot of time and energy and did so much to help make this possible. And, of course, we hope this is just the beginning of what's going to be a continuing effort, not only to continue the conversation, but to build on this and create the kinds of systemic reforms that we've been discussing this morning. So, also, in your packet, you're going to see an evaluation form. AYPF would really appreciate if you could take just a minute to fill that out. And thank you so much for coming today. We look forward to staying in touch with you as we move forward.